As students arrived that morning, there was absolutely nothing to suggest that this day would be different from any other. The autumn weather was pleasant, clear skies, minimal cloud, temperatures about 15 degrees and just a light westerly breeze. As they always did, teachers took attendance, classes commenced, and the familiar rhythm of school life unfolded as it did every weekday. However, at around 11 o'clock, as many classes were preparing for morning recess, the day's ordinary pattern was dramatically interrupted. Accounts vary slightly on who first noticed something unusual in the sky, but most agree it began with a commotion from students whose classroom faced southeast towards the Grange Reserve. The disruption spread quickly. Students in one classroom began yelling and pointing out the windows. Teachers tried their best to maintain order and to continue their lessons, but within moments, more classrooms had erupted with the same excitement. Something unusual was clearly happening and the commotion was spreading throughout the school. Within minutes, students were rushing out of classrooms onto the school grounds, pointing towards the sky above the Grange Reserve. The teachers initially attempted to maintain order, but soon enough they found themselves joining the students, equally transfixed by what was taking place overhead. Based on consistent witness accounts, what they observed was extraordinary. A silver or grey coloured disc-shaped object described as being about twice the size of a family car, seemingly metallic and with no visible markings, windows or other features. The object appeared to be hovering silently at roughly treetop height over the grassy Grange Reserve, adjacent to the school grounds. Those who had a clear view from the school oval described seeing something unlike anything they'd seen before. It was definitely not an airplane or a helicopter. The object was round, like two saucers pressed together, and a greyish silver colour that seemed to reflect the sunlight. Many witnesses particularly noted that it had a distinct silvery purple or grey colour with a slight purple hue in certain light. And what struck many observers most was how it moved. Completely silent and with sudden, jerky movements that didn't seem natural for any conventional aircraft. What happened next is where account details begin to multiply. Many witnesses report the object descended and appeared to land or hover very close to the ground in the Grange Reserve. Some describe seeing flattened grass or circle patterns where it had been. Others recall the object performing unusual aerial manoeuvres, hovering, then moving laterally at high speed, then stopping suddenly before rapidly ascending and disappearing. Strewth, what a morning. For our international listeners wondering about the title of the show, Strewth is what you might hear muttered by a sceptical science teacher when more than 200 of their students simultaneously insist they've just seen a flying saucer hover over their school oval. It's a shortened form of God's truth, an expression of astonishment when confronted with something so utterly unexpected it momentarily suspends belief. It's what slips out when you're seeing something that shouldn't be there, according to everything that you understand about how the world works. I'm your host, and today we're travelling back to April the 6th, 1966, to Westall High School in suburban Melbourne, where the Westall Incident, one of Australia's most compelling and widely witnessed UFO sightings, unfolded in broad daylight. During the initial commotion, several students were brave enough to run across the school oval and into the Grange Reserve to get a closer look. They sprinted to where the object seemed to be hovering, trying to get closer, but before they could reach it, the thing took off, straight up at incredible speed, and was gone in seconds. Perhaps most intriguingly, a number of witnesses report seeing not just one, but multiple objects, Even a science teacher at Westall High School at the time later described seeing one main disc-shaped object accompanied by several smaller objects that appeared to be playing with it, circling and darting around a larger craft. Other witnesses too confirmed seeing more than one object. They observed the main one, which was quite large, but there were also smaller ones moving around. Some accounts even mentioned seeing 5 altogether. The sighting itself lasted between 20 and 30 minutes by most accounts, with the object eventually ascending rapidly and disappearing from view. As the excitement subsided, students and teachers found themselves standing in the schoolyard or at the Grange Reserve, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. For the students who had run onto the Grange Reserve, there was a final unusual detail: an area of flattened grass approximately 9 metres in diameter, where some believe the object had either landed or hovered close to the ground. Those who saw it described the grass as pressed down in a perfect circle swirled clockwise, and the grass felt strange, warm and soft, not like it had just been physically pressed down. The initial reaction among witnesses was a mixture of excitement, confusion, and in some cases fear. For these suburban school children and their teachers in 1966, a time when space exploration was in its infancy and UFOs were a staple of science fiction, but rarely discussed as real phenomena, seeing something so utterly outside their normal experience was both thrilling yet disturbing. As you could imagine, the schoolyard became a scene of absolute chaos. Some kids were crying, some were excited, others just stood there with their mouths wide open, and the teachers seemed just as stunned as the students. What none of the witnesses could have anticipated was how quickly their unusual experience would be met with an equally unusual response, one that many believe was designed to suppress rather than investigate what had occurred at Westall that morning. As the school children returned to their classrooms, still buzzing with excitement and confusion, forces were already being set in motion that would transform a simple UFO sighting into something far more complex and mysterious. Within just hours, strangers would begin arriving at the school. Within days, students would be warned not to speak of what they'd seen. And within weeks, the incident would be largely forgotten by the wider public, but never by those who were there that day, watching the sky above Westall. What makes this case so remarkable isn't just the number of witnesses, but their consistency, the subsequent official response, and the lingering questions that remain unanswered more than half a century later. Unlike many UFO reports involving lone observers on dark country roads, this sighting occurred at 11 o'clock in the morning on a clear autumn day, with hundreds of students and multiple teachers watching from the school grounds. Many of these witnesses maintain the same account to this very day, despite the passage of time. And yet, despite these factors, or perhaps because of them, the Westall incident was met with an unusually swift and comprehensive official response. The witnesses reported men in suits interviewing students, teachers being warned not to discuss what they'd seen, and newspapers mysteriously dropping the story after initial reports. Some witnesses even claim military personnel arrived at the scene within hours. As the mysterious object disappeared from view, leaving the schoolyard in stunned silence, the normal patterns of school life struggled to reassert themselves. Teachers attempted to herd excited students back to class, but the atmosphere had understandably and irrevocably shifted. The morning's events were all anyone could talk about, with children comparing observations and debating what they'd witnessed. Former students remember the rest of that school day was chaos. Nobody could focus on lessons. Every conversation was about what they'd seen. Some teachers tried to continue with their planned lessons, but most just gave up and let students discuss it. A few even conducted impromptu discussions, trying to turn it into a learning exercise about space and science fiction. The school principal, Frank Samblaby, found himself in an unprecedented situation. A former Aussie Rules League footballer who had taken his first headmaster position at Westall just that year, Samblaby was dealing with hundreds of students and multiple staff members claiming to have witnessed something extraordinary. He had to determine an appropriate response. According to several accounts, he initially called an assembly in the school hall around midday, presumably to address the situation and to restore order. The assembly was tense and unusual. Students recall all being called into the hall expecting the principal was going to talk about what happened. But instead, he seemed uncharacteristically stern, almost angry. He told them they hadn't seen anything unusual and they weren't to talk about it. He claimed it was just an aircraft doing tests or something similar. But the students knew that wasn't true. What they saw wasn't any normal aircraft. Multiple witnesses recall the tenseness at the assembly, with Samblaby appearing nervous or even pressured, as though he himself was under strain regarding how to handle the situation. Contemporary sources from 1966 paint a somewhat different picture of the immediate aftermath. The Dandenong Journal, which provided the most comprehensive coverage at the time, reported that the students and staff have been interviewed by RAAF officers. However, according to recent witness testimonies collected decades later, the response was far more dramatic, with some describing men in suits arriving within hours and conducting detailed interviews with select witnesses. Students remember these men showing up in suits without introduction. They went around asking questions to those who had seen the object up close. These men were particularly interested in anyone who had gone to the Grange Reserve where it seemed to land. They had notebooks and were writing things down, but they didn't identify themselves to students. The science teacher who had witnessed the event allegedly told several colleagues that he was interviewed by government officials who strongly encouraged him not to speak publicly about what he'd seen. The officials weren't identified, but they weren't police, and the teacher was told in no uncertain terms not to say anything about the incident. The teacher himself has rarely spoken publicly about the incident. When approached by researchers decades later, he acknowledged witnessing something unusual but declined to elaborate, saying only that some matters are best left alone. This reticence has been interpreted by some as confirming the alleged intimidation, while skeptics suggest it may simply reflect a teacher's reluctance to be associated with a controversial UFO case. What has unequivocally disappeared entirely is television footage shot by Channel 9 on the day of the incident. According to researchers investigating the case, this footage of student interviews has mysteriously vanished from the network's archives, raising questions about whether media coverage was deliberately suppressed. Perhaps even more surprising than the swift arrival of these unidentified officials was the appearance of military personnel. Multiple witnesses report seeing uniformed men examining and cordoning off the area where the circular impression had been found in the grass. After school, not surprisingly, a group of students returned to look at the circles in the grass. But when they arrived, they found men in uniform there. The men weren't regular police, they looked like military personnel to the students. They had the area roped off and were telling everyone to stay back. One of them was taking samples from the ground and putting them in small containers. This military presence has been one of the most controversial aspects of the Westall incident. Official defence records from the period make no mention of any operation in Clayton South on April 6, 1966, and subsequent Freedom of Information requests have yielded no documentation confirming military involvement. However, the consistency of witness accounts regarding these uniformed personnel, combined with the disappearance of the circular ground markings within days, has led many to suspect some form of official intervention. By the evening of April 6, news of the sighting had reached local media. The next day, April 7, the Dandenong Journal ran a front-page story with the headline, "Did a flying saucer land on the school oval?" The article briefly described the incident and mentioned that students and staff have been interviewed by RAAF officers, the RAAF being the Royal Australian Air Force. So for the students and teachers who had witnessed the event, the days following brought increasing pressure to stop discussing what they'd seen. Several former students recall being addressed again by the principal, this time with an explicit instruction not to speak to anyone about the incident, including their parents and especially not to reporters. The students were told to simply forget about it. The principal gathered them together and said it had all been explained as weather balloons or something similar, and that talking about flying saucers would only upset people and make the school look silly. Some kids who had been interviewed by the newspaper got into trouble with school authorities. Another unusual side note is that the incident was never documented in the school's records. No mention appears in school newsletters or annual reports from 1966, despite it being arguably the most unusual event in the school's history. In the weeks and months following the Westall incident, a curious pattern emerged in the official response, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Despite hundreds of witnesses' physical trace evidence in the form of ground markings and initial media coverage, no formal public investigation was ever acknowledged by authorities. The RAAF, which was responsible for investigating UFO reports in Australia at the time through its Unusual Aerial Sightings UAS unit, has no publicly available records of any investigation into the Westall incident. This absence is particularly striking given the Dandenong Journal's specific mention of RAAF officers interviewing witnesses. Leading Australian UFO researchers who have spent decades investigating the Westall incident note it's one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. The RAAF investigated hundreds of UFO reports during that period, many involving far fewer witnesses and less compelling evidence. And yet for Westall, potentially one of the most significant mass sightings in Australian history, there's virtually no official paper trail. This apparent lack of official interest has fueled speculation about a potential cover-up, with many witnesses and researchers suggesting the incidents were deliberately suppressed rather than genuinely dismissed or overlooked. Several former Westall students recall being told explicitly that the sighting involved classified aircraft or weather experiments. One student remembered a teacher pulling them aside a few days after the incident. The teacher told them it was a secret experimental aircraft that wasn't supposed to be flying over populated areas. And that is why everyone was told to keep quiet. The teacher seemed to be trying to reassure them, but it just raised more questions. If it was just an aircraft, why all the secrecy? In the absence of official investigation, various explanations were offered to the witnesses and to the wider community. These ranged from the relatively mundane to the transparently inadequate, with none fully addressing the specific details of what had been observed. The most commonly cited official explanation was that the sighting involved conventional aircraft, either a light plane or a weather balloon. Principal Samblaby reportedly told students during the first assembly, immediately following the incident, that they had simply observed an experimental aircraft or some weather equipment and had let their imaginations run wild. A significant discovery made in recent years by researcher Barry Taylor could support this theory. Taylor uncovered documents suggesting that 5 RAAF Air Training Corps pilots were flying over Melbourne southeast on the morning of April 6, 1966. The presence of these training flights in the area at the time of the sighting could potentially explain what the Westall witnesses observed, particularly if the aircraft caught the light in an unusual way or performed manoeuvres that appeared strange from the ground. However, this explanation fails to account for the object's reported appearance, disc-shaped, metallic, without visible wings or propellers, its movements, hovering stationary then moving at extreme speeds, and the circular ground markings allegedly found at the Grange Reserve. Remember, multiple witnesses specifically emphasised what they observed could not have been conventional aircraft or a balloon. Students who had seen plenty of planes and helicopters in their lives insisted that what they saw that day wasn't anything like a normal aircraft. It had no wings, no rotor, made no sound, and moved in ways that conventional aircraft simply could not. The suggestion that hundreds of them, including teachers, couldn't identify a regular plane or a balloon struck many as implausible. Another explanation offered to some witnesses was that they had observed a target towing aircraft, a type of light plane used to tow targets for military gunnery practice. This explanation at least acknowledged the unusual appearance that might result from seeing an aircraft with a towed object. but again it failed to account for the specific characteristics reported by witnesses. Perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the official response was the apparent coordination between different authorities. Witnesses report similar dismissive explanations from school administrators, local police, and media representatives, suggesting a consistent narrative had been established despite the lack of any formal investigation. This official silence contrasts sharply with the Australian government's approach to other UFO reports from the same period. The RAAF maintained extensive files on UFO sightings throughout the 1960s, many of which have since been declassified and made publicly available through the National Archives of Australia. Whatever the truth behind the official response, its effect was to create an enduring sense among witnesses that their experience had been deliberately suppressed rather than simply disbelieved. This perception was reinforced by the continued absence of acknowledgement in the decades that followed, even as official attitudes towards UFO reports gradually became more open in other contexts. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Westall incident remained largely forgotten by the wider public. Occasional mentions appeared in Australian UFO publications, but with limited witness testimony available and no official documentation to analyse, even ufologists had little to work with beyond the basic outline of the case. But this began to change in the early 90s when several witnesses, now adults with established careers and families, began to speak more openly about their experiences. The catalyst for many was discovering, often by chance, that others still remembered the incident as clearly as they did and were also troubled by its unresolved nature. A pivotal moment came in 2005 when Shane Ryan, a federal, parliamentary, public servant and teacher, began actively researching the incident and seeking out witnesses. Ryan, who had no connection to Westall High School, became interested in documenting the event properly after realising how little formal record existed despite the numerous witnesses. By 2006, he'd formed the Westall 66 UFO Research Group, specifically investigating the case. Ryan's research methodology proved remarkably effective. He reached out to former students through alumni networks and eventually online platforms, ultimately interviewing over 100 witnesses and connecting more than 200 people to the incident. As Ryan's research progressed, he organised informal gatherings of witnesses, creating spaces where they could share memories and compare accounts without the fear of ridicule. These gatherings revealed the remarkable consistency in witness descriptions of the core event. The internet age proved crucial in bringing the Westall witnesses together, amplifying their stories. Online forums dedicated to UFO sightings and unexplained phenomena provided platforms where witnesses could share their experiences, anonymously at first, then with an increasing openness as they found validation in the similar accounts of others. This growing network of witnesses eventually attracted media attention, leading to several documentaries and news features about the Westall incident. The most significant was the 2010 documentary Westall 66, a suburban UFO mystery, which brought together numerous witnesses on camera for the first time and helped establish the case as one of Australia's most significant UFO incidents. And for what it's worth, it remains my all-time favourite paranormal documentary. If you haven't seen it already, as Molly Meldrum would say, do yourself a favour. For many witnesses, participation in these documentaries represented a kind of validation, public acknowledgement of an experience that had been officially denied and personally suppressed for decades. The opportunity to return to the site with fellow witnesses and openly discuss what they had seen was described by several as deeply emotional and cathartic. When they gathered for that documentary, it was the first time many had been back to Westall since leaving school. Standing there with others who saw what they saw, being able to point to where the object had been, having that experience validated by dozens of people with the same memory was all incredibly powerful. After feeling for so long that they couldn't talk about this, suddenly it was not only okay to talk about it, but people actually wanted to hear what they had to say. In the decades since the Westall incident, numerous theories have emerged attempting to explain what over 200 students and teachers witnessed on that April morning. The first, and bizarrely most straightforward explanation, embraced by many witnesses themselves, is that what they observed was genuinely an unidentified flying object, possibly of extraterrestrial origin. This theory takes the witness accounts at face value. A metallic disc-shaped craft of unusual design and capabilities demonstrating flight characteristics beyond known human technology of the era. It appeared over the school grounds before departing at extraordinary speed. UFO researchers who have studied the case extensively point out that when analysed objectively, the witness descriptions don't correspond to any known aircraft of the period. The combination of appearance, its ability to hover silently, then accelerate at extreme rates, and the physical traces left behind all suggest something well beyond conventional technology of the 1960s. Supporting this theory is the remarkable consistency that we've discussed about the witness accounts, the reported physical evidence in the form of ground markings, and the seemingly disproportionate official response. This included, remember, the alleged rapid arrival of military personnel and pressure on witnesses to remain silent. If the object was merely a misidentified conventional phenomenon, critics ask, why would authorities respond with such apparent concern and secrecy? Defence technology historians note that the military testing theory explains many aspects of the case that other explanations struggle with. It accounts for the unusual appearance and capabilities of the object, the rapid military response, the pressure on witnesses to remain silent, and the absence of official records. If this was a classified project that accidentally exposed itself to public view, all of these reactions would be expected protocol. Perhaps the most compelling explanation to emerge in recent years involves the High Altitude Balloon Hubble program, a joint US-Australian project that conducted classified atmospheric research during the Cold War. This theory, developed by Australian UFO researcher Keith Basterfield in 2014, suggests that what Westall witnesses saw was actually a wayward scientific balloon. According to documents uncovered by Basterfield, Hubble balloons were enormous, up to 100 metres in diameter when fully inflated, and made of reflective silver material. They carried sophisticated scientific equipment that would dangle beneath a balloon on long cables, potentially creating the disc-like appearance with smaller objects around it that many witnesses describe. Most significantly, flight records show that Hubble Flight 292 was launched from Mildura on April 5, 1966, just one day before the Westall incident. It's important to point out, though, that Mildura is in the northwest of the state of Victoria, some 550 kilometres away from Melbourne. So that would mean that this particular flight would have to cross a big part of Victoria over plenty of country towns and across the entire city of Melbourne to end up in the outer southeastern suburbs of Westall. A third theory that also focuses on conventional explanations suggests that Westall witnesses observed either a weather balloon, a light aircraft, or some combination of these ordinary objects, but they were misperceived due to unusual viewing conditions or expectations at the time. As for the reported ground markings, skeptics suggest that these may have been natural phenomena, fungal growth patterns known as fairy rings, or normal agricultural effects that were misinterpreted in the context of the sighting. Alternatively, they may have been deliberately created by students as a prank after hearing about the flying saucer nest reported in Tully earlier that year. This conventional explanation, however, struggles to account for the specific flight characteristics described by numerous witnesses. It also fails to explain the apparent official response, including the alleged pressure on witnesses and media to drop the story. A fourth theory approaches the incident from a psychological perspective, suggesting that while the witnesses certainly saw something, their perceptions and memories were shaped by a combination of social factors, expectation, and subsequent reinforcement. Psychologists specialising in memory and perception explain that mass suggestion is a well-documented phenomenon, particularly among groups of children. An unusual but mundane stimulus, perhaps an aircraft catching the light in a particular way, could be interpreted by one influential observer as something extraordinary. This interpretation then spreads rapidly through the group, shaping how others perceive and later remember the same stimulus. The theory further proposes that over subsequent decades, as witnesses periodically discuss the event among themselves and later with researchers and the media, their memories became increasingly aligned and elaborate. This is a well-documented process called memory conformity or social contagion of memory. However, as with the other explanations, this is challenged by several factors. the immediate and consistent nature of the reports, the inclusion of adult witnesses like teachers who would presumably be less susceptible to such influences, and the physical trace evidence reported by multiple witnesses independently before they had an opportunity to compare accounts. Prominent Australian UFO researchers who have documented the period note that in 1965-1966 there was an unprecedented wave of Australian UFO sightings. This Australian UFO wave began in earnest in late 1965, with significant sightings reported in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. By early 1966, reports had increased dramatically, both in frequency and public profile, culminating in what many UFO researchers consider the most intense period of sightings in Australian history. 3 months before the Westall incident, on January 19th, 1966, Australia experienced what would become one of its most famous UFO cases, the Tully Flying Saucer Nest incident. Banana farmer George Pedley was driving his tractor near Horseshoe Lagoon on his property when he reported seeing a brilliant bluish-silver object, about 25 feet in diameter, rise from the swampy area. The object, which Pedley described as like two saucers placed edge to edge, ascended with a slight hissing sound before tilting and rapidly disappearing to the west. When Pedley investigated the site, he discovered a circular area of flattened reeds approximately 30 feet in diameter, swirled in a clockwise direction. Sound familiar? The reeds, normally standing upright in about 6 feet of water, were floating on the surface in a perfect circle, as though they had been pushed down with tremendous force, yet were completely undamaged. Most strikingly, the reeds were not broken but appeared to have been forced underwater and twisted in a radial pattern, forming what local residents soon dubbed a flying saucer nest. The Tully incident quickly captured national attention. The CSIRO, Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, sent investigators who collected samples, and police and RAAF officers also visited the site. Albert Panisi, the property's owner, later discovered additional nests in the following days. Photographs of these circular patterns appeared in newspapers across Australia, with the incident receiving front-page coverage in major publications like The Australian. Scientific investigators eventually proposed explanations ranging from whirlwinds to wallowing crocodiles, though many who examined the site firsthand found these explanations inadequate to explain the perfectly circular pattern and unusual swirling of the reeds. And just 2 weeks prior to Westall, on March the 22nd, 1966, another significant case occurred in Melbourne itself. In the suburb of Balwyn, businessman James Johnson had just finished taking photographs of his new home when he reportedly heard a strange humming sound coming from above. Looking up, he observed a metallic disc-shaped object hovering nearby. Johnson managed to take a single photograph of the object before it rapidly accelerated away. A photo that would become one of Australia's most famous and controversial UFO images. The Balwyn photograph shows a dark, hat-shaped object against a clear sky, appearing to be a solid metallic craft with a distinctive dome. The image was developed immediately by Johnson, who reported it to authorities and local media. Technical analyses of the photograph over the years have produced conflicting opinions, with some experts suggesting it shows a genuine unknown object, while skeptics have proposed it might be a garbage can lid or some similar mundane object thrown into the air. As Australia changed over the decades since 1966, so too has the context for understanding and discussing the Westall incident. The end of the Cold War removed some of the security concerns that might have motivated suppression of unusual aerial phenomena. The digital age has allowed witnesses to connect and to share their experiences outside traditional media channels, and attitudes towards unexplained phenomena have generally become more open and less dismissive in both scientific and popular discourse. These changes have created space for the Westall incident to be reconsidered and documented more thoroughly than was possible in the immediate aftermath. The witnesses now retiring from their careers and reflecting on their lives have found a more receptive environment for sharing their experiences. On a mild autumn morning in April 2016, exactly 50 years after the original incident, over 100 people gathered at a small park in Clayton South. Many were grey-haired, in their 60s or 70s, the former school children who had witnessed something extraordinary half a century earlier. They stood near a steel sculpture depicting a disc-shaped object installed in 2013 to commemorate what has become known as Australia's largest mass UFO sighting. This gathering, part reunion, part commemoration, symbolised how the Westall incident has evolved from a briefly reported school event to an enduring part of Australian cultural history. What might have remained as an obscure footnote has instead become a case study in how extraordinary experiences persist in both individual and collective memory, defying official dismissal and mainstream scepticism through the sheer consistency and conviction of those who are there. One witness, addressing the gathered crowd, observed that 50 years later they were still there, talking about what they saw, not because they were seeking attention or because they couldn't let go of the past, but because some experiences are so profound they stay with you throughout your entire life. What they witnessed that day changed how many of them see the world, and they felt a responsibility to make sure it's remembered accurately. Strewth. What a tale. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, it'd be great if you could tell a few friends, give us a good rating, and perhaps join us next week when we head to Black Mountain, Australia's very own Bermuda Triangle. But until then, stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll catch you next time.